Have you ever imagined surviving in an arena surrounded by monstrous creatures bred solely to kill you? And then, it happens, because you understand them better than anyone else in the universe? Dax Rain, an ordinary human, changed the galaxy with just one ability. Will he survive and save humanity, or become a part of this deadly game? Stick around to see what happens when Dax faces these beasts. What you're about to witness will make you rethink how we perceive animals, war, and humanity itself. Welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story, where tales of aliens, warfare, and cosmic love are told in an entirely new way. Have you ever thought that humanity could change the view of the entire galaxy with just one act? If you want to explore this unexpected story and much more, make sure to hit like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on any future videos. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about human-alien communication? The universe, as it sprawled across endless stretches of time and space, had a peculiar way of entertaining its countless species. Beings who could manipulate the fabric of reality itself, folding space like origami and threading time through their fingertips, still found their most profound entertainment in the simplest form of conflict: combat. The most prestigious of all these spectacles, the one that commanded the attention of the galaxy's elite, was the Nexus Arena. It wasn't a place for intellectual debates or artistic performances. No, in the vast, seemingly enlightened expanse of the cosmos, the greatest display of superiority was still the one where life and death hung in the balance. And the human race, in its unknowing arrogance and surprising ignorance, had walked right into the middle of it. Dax Rain didn't intend to be here. Hell, he hadn't even known it was possible to be here. He was just a kid from Earth, sent as part of a diplomatic envoy to make contact with the advanced species of the galaxy. A bunch of space probes and a collection of videos featuring inexplicable feline behavior were the tools he brought along to represent Earth. He figured that if anything, they'd spend their time talking about advanced physics or perhaps exchanging philosophical views on the nature of consciousness. Instead, the Galactic Council, perhaps a tad too eager to see something new, invited Earth to partake in something far more primal, the Nexus Arena. No one had warned him. They had told him that a misunderstanding had occurred. He had said something, albeit unintentionally, about the High Commander of the Vidian hierarchy looking like a genetically modified eggplant. Apparently, that wasn't received well. Dax, with his characteristic snark, didn't think much of it at the time. After all, the commander had a head that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts of a vegetable patch, and Dax was just trying to be funny. But humor, as he would quickly learn, didn't always translate across species. Particularly not in this case. A few too many shots of what tasted like gasoline but was apparently some sort of delicacy had only worsened matters. The ambassador, who seemed to have more eyes than he knew what to do with, had tried to explain the situation to Dax in the most polite manner possible. The envoy's apology had been drowned out by the buzz of the arena's audience. Dax was being escorted to the preparation chambers, dressed in what could only be described as armor designed for someone much lighter than he. The material felt like silk, but supposedly, it could withstand heat intense enough to turn steel into molten metal. Not that Dax felt reassured. The only thing on his mind was how he had gone from being an obscure representative of Earth to a gladiatorial champion in the blink of an eye. You don't understand, the consul, Elgin, fretted as they moved deeper into the bowels of the arena. These beasts are not just animals. They're intelligent, and they've been engineered to kill. Dax, of course, wasn't listening. His mind wandered to far more interesting matters, like how Earth had ended up with such a disastrous diplomatic setup. Yeah, sure. They're intelligent killing machines bred for slaughter, he muttered. But, hey, how bad could it be? I mean, I've been in a zoo before. Elgin's face paled. This isn't a zoo, Dax. These creatures have no equal. The universe expects you to die. No human has ever participated in this arena. You'll be slaughtered. But Dax wasn't listening. He adjusted the strange, lightweight armor that he had been given, perhaps a little too snug in places, and checked the small utility knife they'd provided. It was laughable, really. His weapon of choice was a tiny blade compared to the beasts he'd be facing. His response to Elgin's panicked words? A nonchalant shrug. I've been to Tanzania. Grew up on a wildlife preserve. I think I'll survive. The consul's face went even whiter. These aren't Earth animals. You have no idea what you're walking into. As the preparation chambers opened, the sound of a roaring, alien crowd reverberated through the walls, each pulse of noise rattling the very foundations of the arena. This was it. Dax was about to step into the Nexus arena. This wasn't just some gladiatorial fight. This was a spectacle that had been perfected over centuries. A place where galaxies of advanced species watched and bet on the bloodshed of the best, the strongest, the deadliest beings from across the stars. In the grandstands, the ruling council of the galactic conglomerate, with their too many eyes, tentacles, and incomprehensible body language, chattered excitedly. The human was about to face not one but 7 of their most ferocious combat beasts. The odds? 98% chance of death within 3 minutes. The betting markets, however, had picked up on something odd. Humans, it seemed, were much more resilient than anyone had anticipated. A strange surge of bets was being placed on Dax's survival. The gates of the arena opened with a dramatic hiss, and the ground beneath Dax's feet rumbled. His eyes adjusted to the blinding lights, and the crowd's noise gradually became a dull hum in the back of his mind. He stepped forward, his face betraying nothing but calm. Indifference, though his heart hammered in his chest. Around him, the arena seemed to shift, transforming into a savanna-like setting. Trees dotted the landscape, and tall golden grasses swayed in an artificial breeze. There was nothing particularly dangerous about the setting itself, but it was the creatures lurking just beyond the gates that made it a lethal environment. And then, the first creature emerged. The Teridian Hellcarver. 12 feet of muscle, horn, and fury. It had 6 eyes, each glowing a menacing ember red, and its bony spine seemed to crackle with bioelectric energy. It tore into the ground as it advanced toward Dax with terrifying speed, its heavy steps leaving gouges in the reinforced flooring. And then, Dax did something that no one expected. He stood there, hands on his hips, a small grin spreading across his face. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what they were witnessing. The beast stopped. Then, it did something even more astonishing. It lowered its head, as if paying respect. One by one, the other combat beasts followed suit, some slowly, others hesitantly, but all of them lowering their heads in an unspoken, unexpected show of deference to the human who had insulted their leader. Dax looked around, noticing that the entire arena had come to a halt. The silence was palpable, and all eyes were now on him. He couldn't help but smile a little wider. Well, that was easy. Next time, I'll bring snacks, he muttered to himself. Then, he turned to face the nearest creature, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. All right, big guy. Let's talk. In the stands, the Galactic Conglomerate Council was in disarray, their minds racing to comprehend what had just happened. For once, the arena had become more than a blood sport, it had become a place of understanding. And Dax Rain? Well, he had just rewritten the rules of the game. Dax's boots clanged against the cold metallic floor as he was escorted through a winding labyrinth of high-tech hallways. Each step echoed with the promise of doom, yet his face betrayed nothing but a cool, indifferent detachment. The Nexus arena was a spectacle, sure, but it felt more like a factory, soul-crushing, sterile, and gleaming with an almost sickening vibrancy. Neon lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the pristine walls, each corner seemingly alive with the hum of advanced technology. But none of it mattered. Dax didn't even pause to take it in. His mind was already working in overdrive, calculating his next move, the game he would play, no, the bluff he would execute. You don't understand, Dax, Consul Elgin's voice trembled behind him, full of quiet panic. These beasts, they aren't just animals. They're intelligent and deadly. We've seen them tear through entire squads of soldiers, reduce champions to nothing but a smear of flesh and bone. You won't survive this. Dax didn't bother turning around. He knew the look on her face, the fear in her eyes. It was the same look his mother had when she realized he was leaving for the front lines, the same terror she had when the war came knocking on their door. Humans were strange like that. We'd create monsters, breed them, weaponize them, but when those monsters turned their attention on us, we were quick to beg for mercy. Funny how the tables turned when the shoe was on the other foot. I've been trained to handle dangerous animals my whole life. I'll be fine, he replied casually, his voice barely a whisper over the mechanical whirring of the arena's door sliding open. It wasn't confidence, not really. It was defiance. Elgin muttered something else under her breath, but Dax didn't care to listen. There was nothing more to say. The truth was, he knew that this was his fight to lose, and even then, he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. The doors slid open before him with an elegant, almost theatrical flourish. And suddenly, the sight of the Nexus Arena filled his vision. This wasn't just a stadium, it was an orchestra of violence, a coliseum where death was the main act, the audience awaiting their next bloodstained spectacle. The arena itself stretched on for miles, a terrifying mix of advanced engineering and brutal aesthetics. High walls lined with impossible materials, shimmering under the arena lights like a backdrop to some nightmare reality show, a place where the gladiators weren't just humans, but the very embodiment of carnage. The floor was an expanse of shifting terrain, ready to morph into any nightmare the galaxy could conceive, deserts, jungles, mountains, or oceans, all at the whim of the arena's unseen architects. It was a place where champions were made, and civilizations watched as their enemies were ripped apart, sometimes literally. But for now, the stage was set. And Dax was supposed to be the meat. On a raised platform, across from him, 7 monstrous creatures, each more terrifying than the last, stood, their eyes locked onto him, as if sensing the scent of fear that was supposed to be there. But Dax had none. He knew how to fight, and he wasn't going to let any of these engineered horrors get the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. The first of the creatures, a Teridian hellcarver, lumbered forward. Its 12-foot frame rippled with muscle, its horned head swaying slightly as it sniffed the air, its 6 glowing eyes narrowing. The creature's jagged, bioelectric spikes crackled with an energy that was tangible in the air, and with each step, the ground beneath it seemed to tremble. It looked like something out of a bad horror movie, if that movie was directed by an alien species who thought that making a monster out of pure rage and sheer strength was enough. Dax's heart didn't race. Instead, his mind focused on the one thing he had, his training. He had fought against nature's monsters before, ones that had been bred by war or survival or plain old greed. He'd seen the ravages of conflict, understood it better than any diplomat or theorist. War wasn't just about guns and bombs. It was about the hunger for power, the thirst for domination, and the lives lost in between. That was the true horror. And this was just another form of it. This was his battlefield. Do you see that? Elgin's voice quivered, but Dax ignored her. They're all modified. These aren't animals, Dax. They're killing machines. Well, what are we then? Dax muttered to himself. Aren't we just the same, if we're bred for war? As he stepped forward, the first creature, Teridian hellcarver, let out a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the arena. Its glowing eyes were locked on Dax, but it hesitated. The other beasts, 6 more waiting in the wings, remained still, their massive forms like statues, frozen in anticipation. Dax's eyes flickered between them, feeling something he hadn't expected, a strange calmness. This wasn't new to him. He had walked into situations where the odds were stacked against him, where survival was a mere afterthought. What was different here, however, was the magnitude of it all, the size of the monsters, the scale of the stakes. A whisper of memory flashed through his mind, a dirt field back home, a family that had bled for this world. His father's dying words as he left for war echoed in his ears. Son, remember, you are never fighting just to win. You fight to survive. Those words had meant something different back then, but here, in this arena, they felt like the only truth that could save him. The beasts began to circle, a predatory rhythm unfolding as Dax stood his ground. The ground underfoot shifted slightly, mimicking the terrain of an African savanna. Dax could feel the weight of the audience's stare, their eyes not just on him, but on the arena. Theirs was a cruel, detached gaze, like vultures picking apart a carcass they hadn't even touched yet. Then, the sound of a gate clanging open reverberated through the arena. The next beast emerged, a Nyxorian phantom cat, translucent and ghostly, its blood glowing in its veins. It moved like liquid shadow, its fangs bared, its muscles coiling in preparation to strike. It was designed for stealth, precision, and ferocity. And yet, Dax didn't flinch. He had been through worse. He'd fought in the streets, faced the loss of comrades, seen the ravages of war, those same battles that had stripped him of his innocence and faith in humanity. A single knife in a war zone was nothing compared to the monster before him. But this was different. It wasn't the creatures that terrified him, it was the meaning of this fight, this absurd show for the masses. "I'm not here for their amusement," Dax muttered, eyeing the beasts, "and I'm not dying for it." With a swift motion, he drew the tiny utility knife. A joke, some might say. But for Dax, it was the only weapon he had, and as a soldier, he knew that a knife wasn't about size, it was about the hand that held it. "Let's see if this arena is ready for humanity," he whispered to himself. The fight had only just begun. The beast lunged, but Dax was already moving, ducking, weaving, his focus sharpened. There was no turning back now. The air was thick with anticipation. The massive gates of the Nexus Arena creaked open with a sound that resonated like a death knell, and the roar of the alien spectators washed over Dax like a tidal wave. He could barely make out the individual voices from the thousands of beings filling the stands, their guttural cries and high-pitched whistles blending into a cacophony of excitement and bloodlust. It was a sound that had haunted the back of his mind ever since the doors first opened, a reminder of the reality he was now trapped in. He had seen this kind of spectacle before, but never like this. This was no gladiator pit on Earth. This was something else entirely. The crowd was a wave of alien faces, shapes, and colors that he couldn't even begin to classify. Some had too many eyes, others too many arms. Some floated. Some slithered. And all of them had come for one thing, carnage. As Dax stepped forward, his boots meeting the hard, unforgiving surface of the arena floor, the roar from the crowd slightly diminished. It wasn't fear. No, it was curiosity, the kind you get when you put a rabbit in front of a tiger. Was this human foolish enough to fight? Or was he simply the next in a long line of sacrifices? His eyes swept the arena, taking in the layout. The landscape was a mix of brutalist architecture and shifting terrain, stretching out before him in waves of dry, cracked earth and patches of thorny, overgrown shrubbery. It was as if someone had taken the worst aspects of every desolate planet and mashed them together to create the ultimate stage for violent, inevitable destruction. His mind flashed to home, to the things he'd seen, the things he'd lost. Earth had long since stopped being the peaceful, utopian place people liked to think of it as. War, poverty, corruption, all had left their scars on the human soul. Dax knew this wasn't much different. Only, here, there were no rules, no governments to regulate the chaos. Just him, 7 bloodthirsty beasts, and the eyes of an entire galaxy watching. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't been raised to fight in some grand intergalactic battle. He was just a man, a human, caught in a mess he didn't ask for. But it was the same mess, wasn't it? He had fought wars before. Not on a battlefield with guns or bombs, but in the trenches of humanity's ever-present hunger for power and dominance. The beast before him was no different than the ones he'd faced in the past. But here, there was one key difference: these monsters didn't have the decency to hide their fangs. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, deep and resonant, as if designed to rattle the bones of any being with the misfortune of hearing it. Welcome, beings of all configurations. Today we witness history, a human challenger facing not 1, but 7 of our deadliest combat beasts. Dax couldn't help but smirk. History? History was a long, twisted narrative of humans throwing themselves into the meat grinder for the amusement of others. He had learned that much in his short time among the stars. The announcer's words sounded like they belonged in some high-budget sci-fi film, not in the middle of an arena filled with creatures who had nothing to lose. The crowd's energy surged, the sound crescendoing into a wave of noise. As Dax took his first few steps into the center of the arena, he felt every eye on him, each one filled with the same hunger, the same desire to see him broken, crushed, or at best, erased from existence. His hand instinctively gripped the small utility knife in his palm. It felt absurd. A toothpick against a storm. The creatures began to emerge from the surrounding gates, each one more grotesque and terrifying than the last. The first to step forward was the Teridian Hellcarver, a towering, 12-foot-tall monster of muscle and spiked horn. Its 6 bloodshot eyes glared at him like burning coals, its breath a mixture of sulfur and death. It stomped onto the ground, leaving massive cracks beneath its feet as the crowd roared in approval. Dax didn't blink. He simply tilted his head slightly, taking in the sight, his face betraying nothing. One after another, the beasts emerged, the Nyxorian phantom cat, whose translucent skin and glowing veins made it appear more ghost than beast, the vortex mantis, with its impossibly sharp, lightning-fast limbs, and the cryogenic worm, whose icy aura made the air around it freeze. The creatures were a mixture of nightmare fuel and engineering brilliance, their genetic makeup carefully designed for one thing, death. But Dax wasn't fazed. Not yet. He stood tall in the center of the arena, his gaze unwavering. 1,000 voices surrounded him, their cacophony growing louder by the second. The betting markets were in full swing, flashing numbers and odds that Dax couldn't care less about. His life was the subject of countless wagers, but in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the fight. Or rather, the charade he was about to put on. As the announcer continued to drone on, Dax couldn't resist the temptation to feed into the madness. He turned his head slightly, glancing over his shoulder at the crowd with a grin that spread across his face like a cat that had just swallowed the canary. He raised a hand casually and said, loud enough for the audience to hear, "Well, I'll say this much, you guys really know how to throw a party." The response was mixed. Some of the crowd laughed, a ripple of amusement passing through them, while others sneered. They weren't used to humans being so flippant in the face of certain death. But Dax wasn't here to entertain them with his fear. He was here to show them something they didn't expect. Something that, no matter how hard they tried to predict, they couldn't control. The beasts encircled him, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes trained on him with a predatory focus. Dax felt their intent, their need to rip, tear, and destroy, but he didn't waver. He knew what they were, just as he knew what they represented. Monsters, sure. But more than that, they were the byproducts of a war-hungry galaxy, a galaxy that had long since forgotten how to build, how to create. All it knew was how to tear things apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the remnants of what had once been. Dax could feel the weight of their gaze on him. Each one of these creatures was a reflection of the war-torn universe from which they came. And as their jaws clicked and claws flexed in preparation for the kill, Dax stood at the center, a quiet defiance in the face of certain doom. The air hummed with tension. Dax exhaled slowly, his gaze locked onto the Hellcarver. His heart beat with an oddly steady rhythm, a reminder of everything he had faced before, of every fight, every loss, every betrayal. War wasn't about victory. It was about survival. And if he had learned one thing in his life, it was that survival was the only victory worth claiming. He smirked to himself and raised his knife, pointing it at the first beast. "All right, big guy," he muttered under his breath, "let's see what you've got." And with that, the first strike was made. The beasts, each one more terrifying than the last, shifted in their stance. Their bodies were massive, crafted for nothing more than destruction. The air thickened with the scent of bloodlust as they loomed over Dax, their eyes locking onto him with a predatory intensity. The sound of the crowd's roars and cheers from the stands reached a fever pitch, their anticipation building like the crackling of an electric storm. Dax stood frozen in place, knife still gripped in his hand, as the world around him spun into chaos. But then, just as the creatures seemed to spring into motion, something remarkable happened. The Teridian Hellcarver, the first and largest of the beasts, slowed its charge. Its 6 burning eyes narrowed for a moment, and it did something no one in the arena could have expected. It lowered its head. The ground beneath it trembled as the massive creature, once poised to tear Dax to shreds, took a respectful step back. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion mixed with disbelief. Then, the Nyxorian phantom cat, whose form shimmered like a shadow in the dim light, halted mid-pounce. Its translucent body flickered, as if caught between 2 worlds. Its glowing veins pulsed, but its aggressive stance softened. Slowly, almost delicately, it lowered its head. The sound of its breath, once menacing, became almost peaceful, like a creature resigned to its fate. The crowd gasped, the noise falling to a stunned silence. One by one, each beast, from the vortex mantis to the cryogenic worm, began to stop in their tracks. Even the Void Sentinel, a being of pure cosmic energy, one that existed beyond the boundaries of physics, paused, a moment of hesitation in its otherwise unyielding demeanor. It bowed slightly, as though acknowledging Dax's presence. The arena, which had been shaking with the energy of an impending battle, now stood still. There was no movement, no sound but the low hum of the arena's energy grid. All eyes were on Dax. The betting markets were frozen, their projections running wild, unable to comprehend the turn of events unfolding before them. Dax stood motionless for a long moment. His mind raced, but his expression remained calm, almost amused. The situation was absurd, almost laughable. He wasn't a beast whisperer, he wasn't some kind of telepathic superhuman. He was just a man who had spent his life in the dirt, wrestling with the creatures of Earth. Humans were supposed to be the inferior species, the ones who needed to be broken and reshaped. And yet here he was, walking among these monsters as if they were simply misunderstood. He took a step forward, then another, his boots leaving soft imprints in the sand of the arena. The creatures followed his movements closely, their massive forms still and docile. The Void Sentinel, an entity made of darkness and starlight, hovered gently above him, its tendrils of energy curling in an almost protective manner. You know, Dax muttered to himself, more out of habit than anything else, this whole situation would be a lot more impressive if I weren't still holding a damn butter knife. The crowd was frozen, each spectator unsure whether to cheer or to run for cover. No one had ever seen anything like this before. Beasts bred for one purpose, destruction. Now, they were bowing to a human, an insignificant, soft-skinned creature by their standards. To the beings watching from the stands, it must have seemed like some kind of glitch in the system. Perhaps the arena's advanced technology had malfunctioned. Or maybe, just maybe, they were witnessing something even more absurd, something that defied their understanding of the universe. But Dax simply smiled. It was a knowing, confident smile, one that conveyed everything he had come to understand about humanity's place in the galaxy. A smile that held a hint of dark humor, the kind that only someone who had lost everything could truly appreciate. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some champion. But he was damned if he was going to be a pawn in someone else's game. He approached the Hellcarver, the largest of the creatures, with slow, measured steps. Its giant snout was lowered, its massive horned head almost touching the ground. The creature's breath was deep and rumbling, its 6 eyes flickering nervously as Dax walked past. Dax extended his hand, palm open, towards the beast's snout. The crowd leaned forward in unison, hoping for the spectacle to continue. But nothing happened. The beast didn't lunge. It didn't attack. Instead, it seemed to sigh. Or at least that's what the translator devices attempted to render. Good boy, Dax murmured under his breath, his voice low and steady. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the beast or to himself. Maybe both. In the observation deck, the cultural attaché Windmere leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. She had known, or at least suspected, what was happening, but even she couldn't have predicted this. I tried to tell you, she said, her voice a strange mixture of awe and amusement. Didn't I? Humans have a special bond with animals. One by one, Dax walked past each of the combat beasts, each one lowering its head in silent respect as he passed. The prismatic stalker, once poised to rend him into pieces, watched him with a silent intensity, its adaptive camouflage shimmering as it revealed its true form, a striking array of iridescent colors. The cryogenic worm, its body trailing a frosty mist, coiled protectively around Dax, its massive eyes blinking slowly in what almost seemed like a gesture of affection. As Dax moved among the beasts, he felt a strange sense of peace, like he was walking through his own garden, surrounded by the creatures he had grown up with. He didn't know how it was happening, but for the first time since stepping into this chaotic, twisted arena, he didn't feel out of place. This was his world, in a strange, surreal way. The crowd was still silent. Even the announcer, usually brimming with theatrical flair, seemed lost for words. The fact that Dax, a human, had not only survived but had somehow tamed these genetically engineered horrors without even lifting a finger was something beyond comprehension. In the Royal Observation Deck, Arch Director Kron's synthetic voice echoed through the space, unable to mask the bewilderment in his tone. "What is this?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "This shouldn't be possible." Dax, still standing in the center of the arena, turned his head slightly toward the booth. The creatures, now arranged in a perfect circle around him, stood in silent submission. "You know," he called out casually, loud enough for the entire arena to hear, "maybe next time, just send an invite to dinner instead of a bloodbath. I'm pretty sure I prefer that." The awkward silence that followed was broken only by the hesitant laughter of a few alien spectators. And for the first time that day, Dax allowed himself to truly smile, a smile full of bitter irony, self-deprecation, and the faintest hint of triumph. Dax stood at the center of the arena, surrounded by creatures that had been engineered for destruction, their once ferocious postures now softened in a strange display of respect. The roar of the crowd had died down, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The officials in the observation deck were staring down at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. It was clear now that they hadn't expected this. No one had. Even the High Commander, Vexer, seemed frozen in place, his many eyes blinking in rapid succession as though he couldn't process what was happening. These beasts weren't supposed to be tame. They were the pinnacle of the galaxy's genetic engineering, a testament to the might and cruelty of their creators. They weren't meant to be understood. They were supposed to be monsters, pure and simple. Yet, here they were, bowing before a human, a creature considered little more than prey in the eyes of the galactic elite. Vexer's voice, low and strained, finally broke the silence, but it came out more as a growl than a command. "How is this possible? These creatures are programmed for one purpose, to kill." His voice faltered as he continued, "And you've made them submit." Dax didn't respond immediately. He was busy walking among the beasts now, his hand brushing gently against their rough hides. It was as if he were in his element, moving effortlessly between them, their hostility now replaced by something akin to peace. He could feel their tension in the way their muscles shifted under their skin, in the subtle flick of their eyes. It was the same feeling he had back home on Earth, growing up in the wild, where animals didn't speak, but communicated all the same. His mind wandered back to his childhood, those years spent in Tanzania, working with wildlife, learning to understand animals better than most people ever could. His parents had been zoologists, and while the rest of the world had been caught up in their own wars and struggles, Dax had spent his days in the dirt, observing, understanding. A lion's growl. A crocodile's stare. A bird's wing beat. They all told a story if you were patient enough to listen. Humans had been doing this for millennia, domesticating animals, coexisting, understanding the unspoken language that was often ignored by those too busy with their own wars. The beasts around him now weren't any different. They weren't just genetically engineered tools of destruction. They were living creatures with instincts, fears, and desires, just like any animal. They just needed someone who could see them for what they truly were. Dax had that gift, a gift that had been honed over years of working with Earth's most dangerous creatures. It wasn't telepathy. It wasn't magic. It was something simpler, something far older than the technology of the galaxy or the cruel games played in arenas like this. It was empathy. He turned to face Vexor, his eyes gleaming with the faintest hint of defiance. "These beasts," Dax said, his voice low but firm, "they're not just weapons. They're misunderstood creatures. They've been bred to fight, yes. But they weren't born to kill. They've been forced into that role, just like we all are." There was a certain bitterness in Dax's voice as he spoke, a bitterness that came from knowing too well what it meant to be forced into a role, to be nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. It wasn't just the beasts in the arena that were misunderstood, it was humanity itself. The universe had been at war for so long that it had forgotten what it was like to coexist, to understand. Humanity had fought wars on Earth for centuries, wars that had torn their planet apart, leaving scars that would never fully heal. And yet, despite it all, humans still found a way to survive. They still found a way to connect. And that was what was happening here, in the midst of the Nexus arena, in the middle of a fight that no one had expected to go this way. Dax wasn't just surviving. He was making a connection. He looked back at the creatures, each one now watching him with an almost reverential gaze. The Teridian Hellcarver, once a symbol of brute force, stood quietly, its massive body no longer a threat but a silent observer. The Nixorian Phantom Cat, its fangs sharp and deadly, now lay still at his feet, its form languid and relaxed. Even the Void Sentinel, the being made of pure energy, hovered near him with an almost protective aura, as if acknowledging Dax's mastery over the chaos that had once defined this place. Vexor's disbelief was palpable. "You're telling me that these beasts, they respond to you? Not just because they're afraid, but because you understand them?" Dax smiled, a wry, almost cynical smile. "I guess you could say that. I've always had a way with animals. But you," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "You don't. You never understood them. You've treated them like machines, like weapons, when they're not. You see, that's the problem with your galaxy. You treat everything like it's disposable. Like it's just here to serve you." Vexor flinched, his pride wounded, but there was something else, something deeper, in the way his eyes darkened. He wasn't just angry. He was afraid. Fear wasn't something Dax had expected to see in the cold, calculating gaze of a galactic ruler. But there it was. Dax wasn't just some human in the arena anymore. He was a threat. Not because of his strength or his technology, but because of his ability to connect, to understand. "I grew up with wild animals," Dax continued, his voice softer now. "I wasn't taught to kill them, to dominate them. I was taught to listen. And that's why I'm still alive. Because, unlike you, I didn't treat these creatures like a trophy or a challenge. I treated them like they were something worth respecting." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The creatures around him, once ready to rip him apart, now stood in quiet attention, as if Dax had become one of their own. The silence in the arena was deafening, broken only by the occasional shift of a beast's massive form. Finally, Dax turned away from the beasts and faced the crowd, his heart beating steadily in his chest. "So, if you all don't mind," he said with a chuckle, "I'm just going to go ahead and leave with these guys. Don't want to overstay my welcome." The crowd, still stunned, didn't know whether to laugh or scream. And Dax? He just winked, his smile wide and absurd, as he walked off the battlefield, followed by 7 of the most deadly creatures in the galaxy. If this was how the universe was going to change, then maybe it wasn't such a bad place after all. The arena, once alive with the deafening cries of spectators and the tension of a deadly contest, had fallen silent. The chaos of battle, the anticipation of bloodshed, and the roaring of countless species faded into the background as Dax made his way slowly toward the exit. The 7 combat beasts, once fearsome gladiators bred for destruction, now followed him in perfect formation, like a procession of reluctant followers. It was as if the universe itself had paused to catch its breath. Dax's steps were steady, his movements casual, but his mind was far from at ease. His heart, still racing from the adrenaline of the arena, had slowed, but it wasn't the danger that worried him. It wasn't the fact that he had just survived a spectacle that no human had ever faced before. It was something else entirely, the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. The implications of this moment stretched far beyond his survival, beyond the idea that he had tamed creatures bred for slaughter. Something had shifted, not just in the arena but in the very fabric of the galaxy itself. His thoughts drifted back to the war on Earth, the wars that never seemed to end, the constant bloodshed, the endless cycles of violence that had torn apart families, homes, and entire civilizations. He thought of his mother, her face worn and withered from years of watching the world crumble around her, and his father, who had once told him, in the end, it's never about winning, Dax. It's about surviving, understanding, and rebuilding. Those words had haunted him for years. In the midst of all the death and destruction, there had always been one truth that Dax held onto, that understanding, true, honest understanding, was the key to survival. The beast before him, with its monstrous form and terrifying roar, wasn't so different from the soldiers, the politicians, the rulers who had waged war across Earth. They were all products of a system designed to use them, to manipulate them into becoming tools of destruction. The difference was that Dax understood that. He had learned to listen, to hear the things that others ignored, the fear in the eyes of an animal, the hesitation in a soldier's stance, the silent cries of those crushed by war. The crowd, still in shock, watched as Dax and his unlikely entourage of beasts made their way toward the portal. His connection with them had not been the result of some mystical power. It had been the result of a lifetime of learning, of growing up in the wild, of understanding that the same forces that drove humans to war also drove animals to fight. And just as humans could learn to control their instincts, so too could these beasts. As Dax reached the portal, the atmosphere in the arena shifted. The noise of the crowd had died down, and what remained was a deep, respectful silence. Even the announcer, usually brimming with dramatic flair, seemed stunned. The spectacle, which had promised to be nothing short of carnage, had transformed into something else entirely. It had become a moment of quiet revelation, a glimpse into what humanity was capable of when it wasn't trapped in the endless cycle of violence. From the observation deck, Consul Elgin watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. She had seen many things in her diplomatic career, but nothing had prepared her for what she had just witnessed. This wasn't just a victory in the arena. It was a victory for Earth, for humanity, in a way she had never imagined. This could change everything for Earth, Elgin said softly, as if speaking to herself. You didn't just survive, Dax. You transformed the galaxy's view of us. Dax, who had been walking toward the portal, paused and turned to face her. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had known this moment was coming. He looked back at the beasts, now resting in a strange form of peaceful submission, before replying. It wasn't about survival, Dax said, his voice steady but full of meaning. It was about respect. He had always known that humanity's strength didn't lie in their weapons or their technology. It didn't lie in the ability to conquer or destroy. Humanity's strength had always been in its ability to connect, to empathize, to understand. And that was what had saved him. Not brute strength, not sophisticated technology, but the ability to see beyond the surface, to see the creature beneath the claws, beneath the fangs. The arena's officials, still in shock, whispered among themselves. High Commander Vexer, whose pride had been bruised so deeply by this human's ability to tame the galaxy's deadliest creatures, stood silently. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even frustrated. There was a strange kind of understanding in his eyes, a recognition that humanity, despite being small, despite being primitive, held something the galaxy hadn't counted on, the ability to break the cycle of violence. For the first time in a long time, Dax felt the weight of his own humanity, not as a curse or a burden, but as a power. It wasn't just about the battles fought in the arena or the war on Earth. It was about something far more significant. It was about the ability to change, to evolve, to learn, and to use that knowledge to shape the future. As Dax walked through the portal, his beasts following behind him, the crowd remained silent. But in that silence, something shifted. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy's gaze was not fixed on destruction or dominance, but on something far more fragile, far more powerful, empathy. Back in the observation deck, Vexer, finally at a loss for words, turned to Windmere, his voice low and grumbling. This changes everything, doesn't it? Windmere's smile was small but knowing. I suppose we'll just have to see what Earth brings to the table next. I have a feeling it's going to be something we've never seen before. Dax's smile, as he left the arena with the creatures at his side, was full of something that few could recognize, a sense of satisfaction. Maybe even peace. Next time, maybe just send us an invite for dinner instead of throwing us into a gladiatorial pit, he muttered to himself. A little less dramatic, but probably more productive. And with that, the universe, whether it liked it or not, had just become a lot more interesting. So, in the end, Dax not only survived the arena but earned the respect of the deadliest creatures in the galaxy. This marks the beginning of a new era for humanity. But is the story truly over? What will Dax do next as humans now have a solid position in the universe? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story to follow the exciting adventures in the next videos. See you next time in the continuation of this story, and make sure to use the secret code Galactic Communication in your comments to let us know you watched till the end.